morning, everyone. Welcome to this year's International Education Conference, entitled Sensing Place, Sharing Stories, Global Literacy in the 21st Century Classroom at the University of Chicago. My name is Meredith Clayson. I am the Associate Director of our Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies. You will see a lot of me today as I will be introducing our speakers and helping to direct traffic. First, I would like to introduce one of my colleagues to say a few words to you, Shaz Razul, Director of the Neighborhood Schools Program.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being out here on such a lovely sunny spring day. I have a minute and a half to say three things. So number one, I'd like to welcome you all to the University of Chicago. I hope for most of you this is a return visit, but for those of you for whom this is your first visit, I hope that this is the first of many visits to the university, and we'd like to welcome you into this community of education and practice and everything, so welcome. The second thing I want to say is I want to salute you for the work you do. In this modern day, I don't think teachers get the due that they deserve, and so thank you for doing what you do. You can't be in higher education without having a strong appreciation for what primary and secondary teachers do, and I think I speak for a lot of us at the University of Chicago. Places like this don't exist if people like you don't do great work, and so again, thank you. And then third, I'd just like to thank all of the people who are involved in the collaboration that brings programs like this together. The university's motto unofficially is let knowledge grow from more to more, and so human life be enriched. You can't do the human life be enriched part working by yourself. You have to work in collaboration with lots of people. And I always feel like programs like this are the university at its best, where people across the university in a lot of different departments come together to share their ideas and to share their networks of community partners, of teacher practitioners, of advisory board members to put together a really interesting program to create a venue where we can convene this really fascinating group to create an opportunity for you all to share your practice and ideas and challenges with your peers. And then finally to create a feedback loop where we learn from that experience and the collective can figure out how to make the next International Education Conference even better than this one. And that's the process we've been in throughout the years as we've gotten to this point. And for that, I have to thank everybody who's been involved in this. And as you can see from the program, it's really a cast of dozens of organizers representing hundreds of teachers and offices and people to put this together. So thank you all. And I'm going to turn it back, and we're going to have a wonderful day. So thank you.
Okay, so first, a few housekeeping details and acknowledgements. First of all, we appreciate that each of you has chosen to be with us today instead of the myriad of other professional development opportunities that are out there. We want this to be an informative, interesting, and interactive day. We also want you to be comfortable. If you need to get up and stretch your legs, get a breath of fresh, snowy air, or whatever, please do so. The restrooms are located, there are two sets. They're located if you go out the back doors and down the stairs, men's lounge on the west side, women's lounge on the east side. If you don't want to deal with stairs, there are other sets of restrooms. The women's room is way down on the east end of the building, but you don't have to manipulate stairs to get there. And there's also an elevator across from the main office to get down to the men's room, which is on the lower floor. You should know that we will be recording the keynote address, so please be mindful of that if you are moving around during the keynote address or the Q&A. Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't extend my thanks to those people and departments that made this event possible. The International Education Conference has been taking place at the University of Chicago for many years now, but this is the beginning of a new era in educator outreach on our campus. In recent history, the Center for International Studies has been the anchor for our collaborative professional development events. However, there's been some restructuring of the Center for International Studies this year, and their mission, at least for the foreseeable future, will not include educator outreach. This took many of us completely by surprise, and is one of the reasons that this year's International Education Conference comes in April rather than in November, which has been our tradition. However, the reason I bring this up is not as an apology for anything, but to acknowledge the great work that the Center for International Studies has done through the years, and to thank those colleagues for the solid base we have to work on as we develop programming for the future. It is now time to acknowledge and thank the colleagues and co-sponsors who have contributed to today's event. So I would like to make several introductions. You have already heard from Shaz Rasool, Director of the Neighborhood Schools Program, which operates under the larger Office of Civic Engagement. Thanks to Shaz and his colleagues in UChicago Engages, we're able to provide refreshments and our event today without having registration fees, so thank you, Shaz. Representing our Center for East Asian Studies, our Associate Director, Abby Newman, Assistant Director for Programming, Connie Yip, and Outreach Coordinator, Myra Sue, all standing in the back of the room. Representing our Center for Latin American Studies, our Associate Director, Natalie Arsenault, and Outreach Coordinator, Claudia Garibaldi. Representing our Center for Middle Eastern Studies, our Outreach Coordinator, Alexander Barna, and Outreach Assistant, Abby Kirschbaum. The Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies is represented by yours truly and our Outreach Coordinator, Esther Peters. And finally, thanks to Carol Enghe from the Oriental Institute, who is unable to be with us today, and of course to all of our colleagues at International House who are hosting us and helping us run the event today. So thank you. And now to introduce our keynote speaker, Don Bell. Don Bell has traveled to 80 countries over the past 3 decades, working as a writer and editor of articles for National Geographic. He has reported on the defining issues of our time, such as Islam and the West, the effects of global climate change, and the geopolitical trends that shape our world. As senior editor of National Geographic from 1998 to 2010, he helped to guide the magazine's coverage of topics ranging from weapons of mass destruction to the legacy of colonialism in the modern Middle East. Don has worn many hats during his National Geographic career: writer, associate legends editor, senior editor, foreign editor, chief foreign correspondent, and most recently serving as an editorial consultant and contributing writer. Don has authored major articles on Russia's Lake Baikal, Sweden, Baja California, Israel's Galilee, the ancient city of Petra in Jordan, the Golan Heights, Lawrence of Arabia, Islam, the European Union, Pakistan, India, Syria, Arab Christians, Cold War science, and the Russian Arctic. Don has received numerous awards for his writing, including the Award for Excellence from Communication Arts, the National Magazine Award, an Award of Merit from the Overseas Press Club, and a First Place Award from the North American Travel Writers Association. Don has been guest on the News Hour with Jim Lehrer, NPR's Morning Edition, The Diane Rain Show, CNN, Fox, and newscasts around the world. He has lectured at universities across the United States. He currently teaches journalism at the University of Richmond and serves as the University Outreach Director of the Out of Eden Walk, in collaboration with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. It is wearing these hats that Don will address us today, with a call to global awareness and a summary of his own journal via National Geographic to a greater appreciation of the world we share. Please join me in welcoming Don Bell as he presents our keynote lecture, To Walk the World.
Thank you, Meredith, for that generous introduction. Thank all of you for coming today. Thanks also to all the people that she mentioned. This is a group effort. You know, the words on the screen or the organizations or departments represented on the screen have come together to put this day together, and I'm deeply appreciative. I'm really, really happy to be here. with you all. I met Meredith back in October. I was here at Northwestern to do a workshop and met Meredith that day, and we hit it off instantly and had lots to talk about, and so she invited me to come back and address you all. And I'm really pleased to be here. As I look out over the audience, it's really nice in certain ways to finally get a look at National Geographic readers. I sense that people in this room have read National Geographic. One of the downsides of being a writer at National Geographic is that you rarely hear from anyone, except when they're mad. You know, you get these hate letters from people who don't like some political statement you made or whatever about your articles, but there's kind of a disconnect from your audience. There are all these millions of people around the world that read the magazine, but you never really get to see them. And so whenever I get a group of National Geographic readers or would-be readers together in a room, it warms my heart because I feel as if I'm among friends and among my readers, and so I'm especially pleased to be here for that reason. I also want to say I spent a couple of years growing up in Chicago, and days like today remind me of really the only clear memory I have of Chicago. I lived here between the ages of 8 and 10, lived in Palatine, one of the suburbs out from town, and my most vivid memory, I think, of living in Chicago was this time of year, April. You know, I was a Cubs fan. I wanted to go out and play baseball, play catch and stuff. And I remember vividly the sting of the baseball against my cold hand on an April day, you know, with trying to push the season, trying to push baseball season by getting out and playing before it was warm enough to do so. I see there's snow in the forecast, and I guess that's not all that unusual here. Anyway, thanks again for inviting me here. I thought what I'd do this morning is to just kind of give a little bit of background on how my career developed and how my own appreciation for global cultural awareness really took root. As you are working with students and trying to inspire them to learn about the world, trying to teach them about the world, about the way people live in other places, it may be of some value to you to know that I started from a very, very parochial place. I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. After we moved from Chicago, we went to South Carolina, where I was seen as a Yankee and had to fight every day at recess for about 6 months. That's another story. But you know, back in the 1960s, Columbia, South Carolina, the kids even at my elementary school were still fighting the Civil War, and so
they still are.
Yeah, still are, exactly. So anyway, that was an interesting kind of introduction to American history, to find out that I was the enemy all of a sudden, which is a valuable lesson in lots of ways. But I grew up there. I got out and loved nature. I loved exploring and going down rivers and learning about natural history and stuff. But my world was tiny, very tiny. And so I'll be telling you in a minute about a trip that I made when I was in college that opened my eyes and started me on a journey that eventually led me to National Geographic and to this podium today. So I'm very grateful for all that. You know what, I'm going to turn on my timer so that we don't go too far over. And I would like to leave room for questions at the end of this. So I think what I'm going to do is try to talk for about 45 minutes, more or less, and then open it up for questions, and I'm happy to answer anything that comes up. And then you'll get another shot. Later, we're going to do a second session, as you see on your program, to talk about the Out of Eden Walk, which I'm involved in, which is a great, great learning tool for educators like yourselves. I'm going to move on from this here. To Walk the World is the title of this thing, but I want us to talk first about the idea of crossing invisible borders, which I've found is a really kind of useful way to look at what we do whenever we start to think internationally. These days, of course, the borders are invisible depending on who you're talking to. You know, if you ask Vladimir Putin what the border between him and his country and Ukraine is, you know, in his mind it's an invisible border. There is no border. So, you know, in the geopolitical context, the Islamic State, for example, in Iraq, Syria, in the Levant, and in the Middle East, has this kind of figment, this imaginary Islamic State, this caliphate that they, so they see the borders that were drawn after the First World War as very much invisible. Their reality supersedes that and turns those borders invisible. I was in Hungary a few years ago working on a story, and I was struck by the number of people in Hungary that were talking about Greater Hungary. They use it all the time. The Fidesz, the right-wing group that's now in power in Ukraine, in Hungary, has always talked about Greater Hungary, and they put it on their bumper stickers. It's almost like their signature issue in a way. And so they don't recognize the confining borders that Hungary occupies on those maps. They see Greater Hungary, including Hungarian speakers in neighboring countries. Much the way Hitler did, you know, I mean, in the lead up to the Second World War, he invaded the Sudetenland, right, because to protect the German speakers there. He ignored international borders. He considered them invisible. You know, you travel to Lebanon, for example, and, you know, these aren't political distinctions. These aren't counties in Lebanon. These are ethnic and religious divisions within Lebanon, what I call the tribes of Lebanon. There are so many different variations in the Christian, Muslim, Sunni, and Shia Muslim community there. There's also Druze, which is a very powerful community. But as you travel around Lebanon, you're constantly moving across invisible borders as you move from place to place, from one ethnic or religious identity to the next. And of course, the kind of the classic case of invisible borders is what happened to the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, where the Ottoman Empire went away, having allied with Germany in World War I. They lost. What happened in the lead up to the peace agreement that ended the First World War was that Britain and France primarily, but the Allied powers had made secret plans to divide up the lands of the Ottoman Empire into zones of influence, which later became countries that we now recognize: Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, the Jordanian Kingdom, Lebanon, Palestine, which later became the map that we're familiar with today, which includes Israel and Kuwait and Iraq and these other countries. So in the aftermath of the First World War, it was obvious that these borders, these things that had been called international borders, were malleable. They were invisible in certain ways. I was walking with my friend Paul Salopek, who we'll talk more about later today, through Wadi Rum in southern Jordan a couple of years ago with my son Charlie. He's the guy in the hat here on the left. And Paul is in the back there with glasses on, and then the man on the right is a Bedouin friend of mine named Hamoudi Abdul, who has been, I met him years ago when I was working on the Lawrence of Arabia story that Meredith told you about. Hamoudi's a fantastic guy. I mean, he's just an absolute master of his universe. He lives around Petra. He's a member of the Hoytat tribe, the famous tribe of Ada Abataya. Those of you who've seen Lawrence of Arabia, the movie. Hamoudi is a Hoytat, but his band, his sub-tribe, is the Bedouin tribe. And when we were walking through Wadi Rum, he was far removed. He was maybe 50 miles away from his home territory. And as we walked through Wadi Rum, Hamoudi was really despondent. This is somebody who's always chipper, always adventurous, totally competent at everything he sets out to do, and he was like a shell of his former self. And then finally, as we were walking along, Paul and I were concerned about him. We thought he was maybe sick or something, and we finally got to the bottom of it. We were walking through tribal territories as we moved through Wadi Rum that he wasn't really all that familiar with. These were all sub-tribes of the Hoytat, but they were not his tribe. And so he felt in grave personal danger walking through these other tribal territories as we were walking up from Jordan, or from Wadi Rum up toward Petra, which is a distance of about 50 or 70 miles. Hamoudi refused to leave the highway because he was afraid that on either side of the highway was danger, symbolized here by stolen crossbows. But it was very interesting to me. This was somebody who I had always admired as the most competent person, one of the most competent people I've ever known, one of the most confident and one of the most masterful in lots of ways. And he was reduced to a puppy dog who was walking down the center of the highway to avoid inadvertently stepping on tribal territory that didn't belong to him. These are all invisible borders. Jordan is a country, it's got a map, and all these tribal borders are invisible, but everybody knows them. It'd be like walking around the streets of Chicago. I mean, you go into certain neighborhoods, and it's a good idea to know what that neighborhood, what those invisible borders are between sections of the neighborhood or on a street. Going back to, I was talking about my own personal story, which may be of interest to you. I hope it is, because I'm going to talk a little bit about it here. But in the spring of 1973, I was like a junior at the University of South Carolina. Like I said, I never really left South Carolina. I was local boy, right? I was playing soccer with a couple of these guys in this picture, and we decided, just for the heck of it, in the spring of 1973, to take a trip, to take one last trip before we all had to grow up, right? And we went from Columbia, South Carolina to Panama. Drove. None of us had ever been in that part of the world before. None of us spoke Spanish. We bought this white car, this International Travelall, which is kind of a precursor to the Suburbans of today. It was a big, humongous station wagon. We piled out all our junk in it and set off for Panama, right? From Columbia, South Carolina. And we just bounced around on these back roads. Before I left, though, I'd gone to my writing professor, my creative writing teacher at the University of South Carolina was a poet, the poet in residence, James Dickey, who some of you may know from having written Deliverance, the famous novel that became a movie. James Dickey listened to me and signed off on an independent study project for me to go. I was a poet at that point, a poet carpenter. I was putting myself through school as a carpenter, writing poetry at like 4 o'clock in the morning, kind of captured the eternal verities before going off and, being a construction worker all day. But he believed in me, and he said, sure, I'll sign this thing. You go off, you get 15 hours of credit to travel around with your buddies on this vacation, as long as you keep a journal of what you see and do. Great, a fantastic deal. And so that was my mission on this trip. The others, not necessarily. The guy on the left was on his way to medical school the following year. The guy in the red shirt was just, one of these guys, I don't know why he came on the trip. Everything that happened, he complained about. Everybody knows somebody like this, right? He made fun of the people that we met. I mean, he didn't speak Spanish, so he didn't know what they were saying, but they didn't look like us, they were dirty, da-da-da-da-da. He was like Don Rickles. He was just constantly just riffing on how bad the people were that we were coming into contact with, and complaining mightily about every single thing that happened. We were camping out, right, roughing it, and so there was plenty to complain about. And it just got to the point where all of us were ready to wring his neck, and he finally bailed and flew home from Costa Rica because he had enough. But we had to put up with him for about 6 weeks on this trip. And this is a local guy that we met in Mexico who kind of took a shine to us and let us camp on his land for the night. That was kind of the way we did it. We make ourselves known to these folks. The reason I'm telling you this is because the U.S.-Mexico border here on the right is a very real border. What I didn't realize, having never done this kind of thing before, was that I was in a way crossing an invisible border in my own mind or in my own heart that separated me from my parochial, narrow, closed existence to that point and a much wider world that I later wound up making my home in certain ways. And it was interesting, and the thing that really tipped me off, this is our route, right? This is the star in the upper right is Columbia, South Carolina, all the way down to Panama and back. One of my friends and I ran out of money. Our car broke down, this white car, this beautiful white car, completely tanked in Costa Rica, and so we wound up having to hitchhike home. A friend of mine, one of those guys in the picture, and I hitchhiked home from, I think it was the border of Panama and Costa Rica all the way back home, and that was a whole nother thing, and I won't bore you with those details. But this is basically our route. We were just making it up as we went along. And as we traveled, we traveled across the American South, and then crossed into Mexico at a place called Laredo, Texas. I don't know if any of you have been to Laredo, Texas, or are from there or something. Laredo, Texas is a fine city. In 1973, to the eyes of somebody who hadn't done this sort of thing before, it was a hellhole. I mean, I could not believe that places like that existed in the United States. This is Laredo, Texas, and I apologize if I'm insulting your city. I don't mean to. I'm making a point here, because from my experience, Laredo, Texas was just this really, really, really poor city. It just felt like a place not of the United States. It felt like a different place. As you drive down from San Antonio toward Laredo, you're starting to hear Mexican music on the radio and stuff, so we're preparing ourselves to enter Mexico. And when we got to Laredo, we felt like we were already there. It just was, it was poor, it was different from any place I'd ever been. This is maybe an artist's conception of what my view of Laredo, Texas in March of 1973 on our way south. Rusted out automobiles, dust, tumbleweeds, stray dogs. I mean, it was just that kind of a place. After spending 2 months traveling around down in Mexico and Central America and having this sort of immersive experience, my friend and I hitchhiked back north again, went through Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and crossed into Laredo, Texas again, 2 months later. And it was interesting, and the reason I'm telling you this is because this is the way Laredo, Texas looked to me when I came back. It looked like heaven on earth. I could not believe how lush and green and beautiful and rich and wealthy and absolutely gorgeous this city was. In the course of those 2 months of traveling, my personal self, something inside of me had changed to the point where my whole perspective had shifted. And Laredo, Texas, which previously had been one way, was in fact a very different way when I came back. I mean, I was so thankful to be back in the United States. And I couldn't believe how wealthy our country was. I just was astonished by it. After spending 2 months looking for campsites, you're always, when you're traveling, you're always scanning for campsites. And all I could see when we crossed into Laredo on the way back was campsites everywhere. There was green grass everywhere. There were lots of places to pitch a tent, So anyway, I just say this because I crossed some sort of an invisible border in my own perception, in my own self, that allowed me to enter into a sort of an immersion in the culture that I'd just been in, to the point where I started to see the world through those eyes. I can just imagine, what the United States looks like for somebody who has traveled up from one of these countries in Central America, from Honduras or Guatemala, or fleeing war, the Civil War in Guatemala in the 1980s sent a huge pulse of migrants up to the United States, and it helps me to understand what the magnetism of our country is and what America looks like to their eyes when they cross that border and leave a place that is so much different and come to our country. So that was a really valuable lesson. I felt like I had seen, it's like the T.S. Eliot line about, the end of our exploring is to return to the place where we started and to know the place for the first time. I've always felt like that's from Four Quartets, if anybody cares, but it's it's always rung in my head when I go to these places, and I'll show you some other pictures of other places I've been, but I always come back to this country and kind of know it for the first time. I see it through fresh eyes because I have changed. It hasn't changed, I have. Which is a kind of an eternal truth, I think, when you're talking about building global awareness in kids or in anyone. Now I'm going to talk for a second about what I call the slow road to global literacy. And you know, one of the valuable things that trip gave me was a glimpse, just a distant glimpse of what I wanted to wind up doing for a living. At that point, I had no clue that I wanted to be a journalist, that I wanted to work for National Geographic. But that act of sitting around the campfire at night and trying to put into words, everybody else is like snoring, passed out from tequila or something, and I'm the guy who's sitting up late at night around the campfire writing in my journal. But that, in a way, is exactly what I've done ever since. It was a glimpse of what my passion was. I, alone among this group, really dug the experience. I think everybody else was like, phew, we're glad that's over. Now we can get back to real life, etc. In me, for whatever reason, it kind of flipped a switch, and I was like, I want to do that again. I could do that indefinitely. Not indefinitely in the way that Paul Salopek is, where he's walking 22,000 miles around the world. I don't go that far. I like to come home at night sometimes. But it gave me a taste, just a taste, and it sparked a dream. It gave me my dream, which was to travel, to write about it, to take photographs sometimes, but to somehow capture in words the experience that I'd just gone through so that I could share it with someone else. Because it was so profoundly moving and so beautiful or so tragic or so something. It kind of sparked the communicator in me and made me want to be able to tell those stories. I'm going to fast forward over the part where I moved from carpentry, from construction work into freelance writing, getting published, finally getting the attention of National Geographic, working that, doing something for them, having succeeded as a freelance. They finally agreed to take me on staff. I moved from South Carolina to go to work for the magazine in 1985, and as Meredith said, over the course of about 25, now 30 years, I've worked for National Geographic, mainly traveling the world. Also, working in the office to craft strategies for covering the world, but then also getting out, having the privilege, a rare privilege in my own life to get out and travel the world and have experiences and meet people all over the world and see the world through their eyes. Much as that little baby step that I took in Mexico and Central America, I've been able to do that for much of my career. As I've gone through my career, I've discovered that some of the most valuable lessons I've ever learned, in certain ways, date back to that first trip. But they involve slowing down, taking time to get to know people. You know, the world is full of journalists, especially now, or would-be journalists, or travel writers who blaze through. I mean, a typical broadcast correspondent might zoom into a story. Everybody's cutting budgets, etc., and so we're inundated with this ephemeral, sort of superficial information about places, where it's kind of a joke among correspondents. You fly into the capital, you interview the cab driver on the way from the airport to the hotel, you make an appointment to see some government officials, you may wander out to a cafe or something and have a local meal and talk to somebody there, and you get in the cab, you interview the cab driver on the way back to the airport, and you fly home. That's the way most news is generated these days. And what National Geographic enabled me to do, and continues to do to a large degree, that I have tried to take advantage of for the benefit of my readers, is to go slower than that. I would go to a place for like a month, or 6 weeks, or 2 months, or sometimes even 3 months. I was at Lake Baikal, which you mentioned, in Siberia for a whole summer. The summer of 1990, I spent on a Russian ship traveling around Lake Baikal. Nobody gets that kind of time anymore. But it gave me the opportunity to really settle in, understand, get to know people, and write from a place inside myself rather than just pushing the information around or the facts around on paper. And that, I feel like that's always served my readers and has built, I hope, in them an appreciation and a connection to those people that I'm writing about. So yeah, I'm just going to give you a couple of little, not tips really, but just some principles that I've lived by in certain ways. I didn't come to them easily because I'm a type A. I mean, my first impulse is to be hyper-responsible when I get an assignment. I want to make a long to-do list of all the things I want to do, and it often involves doing, just as I described earlier, interviewing the president of a country or the minister of the economy or the minister of the interior or somebody of that nature. Ticking off that to-do list has always been an important part of my own makeup. I feel like I'm trying to do a responsible job as a journalist. And it's taken me a while to develop the skill set, or at least the attitude, to slow it down more than that, and to give myself the time to actually indulge in meeting people and spending time with people. So anyway, these are just some tips. I mean, this may be the kind of thing that you can pass along to students in the classroom, but maybe it'll just inform your own thinking about, kind of what's involved in developing connections with people in foreign countries. First principle, slow down, just what I said. This was a family that I met in northern Mexico. I was working in Baja California. It's ironic, I guess, or maybe fitting, that one of the first stories I did, the first foreign story I did for National Geographic, was about Mexico, about Baja California. And of course, I was so thankful to get back to Mexico after having traveled there earlier. But I spent, I got myself a truck and a camper, and I just took all the back roads, just went wherever my little heart desired. I was there to report on some big issues in Baja California, the lack of water, etc., the tourism plans that the government of Mexico was making for Baja to turn it into a tourist mecca. But I was able to take those back roads and camp out in places. And so it brought me into contact with people like these. This is the last little cluster of Pai Pai Indians. The Pai Pai were one of a number of tribes that occupied Baja California when the Spanish missionaries arrived in the 1700s to try to convert them, to try to settle. They had a rough go in Baja California, first of all because it was a very sparsely populated place. The peninsula line gets like 4 inches of rain a year, and so it's marginal survival at best. And so these missions fizzled out after a while. They also gave diseases, the story, the smallpox and these other diseases were passed along to the parishioners, to the converts, and sooner or later the Spanish missionaries realized that they didn't have any more, that their flock had dwindled, and so they pulled up stakes in Baja California, Lower California, and moved to Alta California, Upper California, which we now know as California. And of course the missions there had better success, and we all know the history of California and how those missions later developed into communities, et cetera, et cetera. But left behind in Baja California are these hardy little groups of indigenous people like the Pai Pai Indians. And so I spent, I guess, a week, or maybe 4 or 5 days, with this family and just got to know them and heard their perspective on things, and I helped them, with their chores and patted their grandkids and all that sort of thing, just to understand what their life was like. And it was a really rewarding experience, and it was the first time I'd really felt free to do that kind of thing on an assignment. I mentioned before, take the back roads. This was actually in Syria in 2009. My friend Ed Cashy and I were traveling around Syria reporting on Bashar al-Assad's Syria before the revolution. This was 2 years before the civil war began in Syria. And what we like to do, I mean, we actually had a government minder, right, that was assigned to us that watched everything we did, blah, 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 you know, just like a vulture perched on our shoulder. But the beauty of it was that he was lazy and always wore, I mean, we go out for the day in our, you know, field clothes and stuff, and George, the minder, would come in, he'd be all dressed up. Not like me, but at the moment, but he'd be in really nice dress shoes and all spiffed up. And so we kind of used that against him. We developed a little strategy, Ed and I did. And so going out into a field and picking cotton with local people in Syria on a back road was something George didn't really want to do. He'd stay in the car. And so we could go out and stay there and interview people. I had the lady here on the left is an interpreter who was helping me with Arabic. I speak some Arabic, but it's not good enough to carry on a long conversation. And so she was with me, and we were out picking cotton, and George was back in the car fiddling around with whatever he was doing. Same sort of thing when we got back to Damascus at night. He'd be exhausted, right? We were paying for his hotel. We were paying for his room in the Four Seasons in Damascus. So George would come in for the night, 5 o'clock, 5:30, something like that. We'd be like, oh, George, we're so tired, we're gonna call it a night. And he'd go up to his room, and we'd give it about 45 minutes, and then we'd go back out with Maya, my interpreter, and just quietly leave the back door of the hotel and get out and report, talk to people. I got so much material because George was just lazy and didn't want to be bothered. He was upstairs watching adult movies in his room. We were out interviewing people and finding out what was really going on in Syria. Build relationships. This is an obvious thing, but the taking time and slowing down also gives you a chance to develop real relationships with people. It's not just a quick conversation and move on, but you're able to come back to them. Come back. This is in southern Iraq. This is near Nasiriyah, Iraq, and the gentleman here on my right is what they call a marsh Arab, somebody who lived in those big Mesopotamian marshlands until 1991 when Saddam Hussein drained them to punish the Shiites for uprising. And this gentleman and his extended family, 30, 35, 40 people, all moved to a kind of a slum area outside Nasiriyah when the marshes were drained by Saddam Hussein, and they've lived there ever since. And I met him, I think I may have met him through a connection. Somebody recommended that I stop by and see him. And so I did. I introduced myself. We had a nice little chit chat, you know, what they always do in Iraqi homes is welcome you in. They sit there, they give you tea, many glasses of tea, on, and then finally you part and make pledges to get back in touch with each other. The difference between me and a lot of other people is I actually did it. I mean, I would stop, I would go by Nasiriyah every once in a while. I'd drive by his little compound, his little ramshackle house on the side of the road, and I would stop in and I'd talk to him. And every time I passed by, I always tried to leave room in my schedule to stop in and see this man for a few hours. And so we developed a friendship of a type, a relationship at least, where he was willing to tell me things and volunteer things and share things with me that he might not have been otherwise. And then finally, I mean, what happened was the marshes were drained. They were destroyed. 2003, Saddam was deposed. The marshes had been refilled. But at one point, this fellow told me that he missed the marshes so much when he was living in Nasiriyah in this desert environment that he and some of his friends, his neighbors from the marshes who had been forced to flee and move to Nasiriyah, had built a little marsh in their backyard to make them feel at home, like it was back in the marshes, with reeds and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, wow, that's cool, let's go see it. And so from that point on, every time I would stop by, we'd go back to this little marsh, this little man-made marsh that he had created in his backyard by diverting some drainage ditch water into a little pond that he dug to make himself feel at home. And all the menfolk in the clan gather there in the evening to watch birds, etc. It's like a little slice of the marsh that they've recreated for themselves in Nasiriyah. And so I wound up writing about that in my story, but none of that would have been possible I wouldn't have even known about it, much less written about it, if I hadn't had the opportunity to build a relationship with him so that he volunteered things to me that he might not. Often, you don't even know what's interesting until you hang around for a while, and then something happens and you're off to the races. Listen, this is an obvious one. I spend much, believe it or not, I'm sitting up here talking, but I actually spend a lot more time listening than I do talking in these situations. It's an obvious thing. These are actually women in Pakistan. I was in Islamabad, Pakistan, covering all of Pakistan for a National Geographic story that came out in 2007 to mark the 60th anniversary of the birth of Pakistan. And I traveled like 8,000 miles all over the country. It was crazy. I could go on and on about it. But one of the things that was happening while I was there was these religious jihadists, these jihadists had taken over a mosque, the Red Mosque in downtown Islamabad, that was about half a mile from the president's palace. This was during the days when Pervez Musharraf was the president of Pakistan. They took over a mosque in downtown Islamabad, a stone's throw from the president's house. And it was a big deal. I mean, there were hundreds of these jihadis who were in there, and they're women folk. These guys, these ladies that I'm talking to are fully covered, but they had taken over a girls' school that was next to the mosque in downtown Islamabad. And the whole compound was encircled by Pakistani army in full riot gear, ready to attack this place, and so they were besieged. And I talked my way in to try to understand what their point was. Why are they doing this? And as these ladies, after I'm listening to them talk, I mean, it's really bizarre and hardline stuff. I couldn't believe it was what I was hearing in a way. And then they said, would you like to see the school, the girls' school that's next to the mosque? I said, sure. And it was at that point that I realized that they had taken these hundreds of little girls, you know, from the ages of 6 to 10 or 12 maybe, and kind of spread them throughout the girls' school as human shields to prevent the Pakistani army from attacking. I mean, the fact that this group was so hardcore that they wanted to create human shields or use 8-year-old girls as human shields in the Xerox room, in the library, in the bathroom, they were just everywhere in strategic positions so that if the army did attack, if the army were to come in and just lay waste to the place, that there would be all that loss of innocent life and they would have a PR victory. But all this just comes from listening to people that, you know, ordinarily people like that I'm not necessarily interested in spending a lot of time with, but it was necessary for the good of the story, and I wrote about that in the lead of my story. It was really kind of indicative of where Pakistan is right now. Keep an open mind and a closed mouth. This is just for fun. I threw this in here because I was traveling around India with these truck drivers. I was doing a big story about the highways of India, and I felt like the best way to get that story was to just go with one of these long-distance truck drivers who was hauling stuff around India. So Ed, the photographer, and I spent probably about a week and a half, 2 weeks, traveling with these guys and just living their life. I mean, it's a really funky, fun life. And this is the way they bathe. This is how they bathe themselves. And I just kind of jumped in and did it with them, and they all got a big kick out of it, as you can tell. Do real stuff. This, again, is just something that maybe is my inclination. But this was in Mongolia a few years ago. I was working on a story about Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, which has been inundated with people from the countryside they had 2 bad winters in a row, and so what happened was during Soviet times, they brought everybody into the cities. You know, because Mongolia was under the Russian thumb, they wanted to kind of collectivize all the farming. They wanted to bring lots of people into the city, and so these nomadic or herding people, a herding culture, in the course of generations, maybe 4 or 5 generations, all the herding instincts, all the skill set was kind of weeded out of the population, so that they lost that continuity with their culture. And then after the Soviet Union fell, Mongolia was a free country again, and a lot of these people who were living in squalor in the cities decided to go back out and make a go of it in the countryside. And so this was a kind of a typical example. This old dude on the left is a wonderful, wonderful guy, but he had, it was actually a fairly successful livestock herder, making a go of it on the steppes of Mongolia. The guy on the right to my left there in the red t-shirt is his son-in-law, who was in the process of moving from the land back to the city and trying to make a go of it in the city. But it was just, and this was taken as we were trying to get some hay in for the wintertime, because those bitter cold Mongolian winters will kill livestock. They have to eat fodder, and so we were cutting, hay and other grasses to put up for the wintertime. But I went back and back and back. I mean, every weekend I would go out there like a little vacation, right, from being in the city, which is highly polluted, in a city. But I'd go out to the countryside and check in on the old guy and his wife and see how they were doing. And over the course of time, I just sort of pitched in and did what they needed doing. And we, again, developed a relationship, and I wound up really writing a lot about them in my story. Really important to write it down. I mean, a lot of this stuff, the things that we experience are somehow preserved, or sometimes even improved, or they grow in the telling in a certain way. And so writing things down is a really important skill. I mean, this is me doing essentially what I was doing around the campfire in 1973, scribbling in my notebook while everybody else was sawing logs around the campfire. This is, again, is in Pakistan, the backstage of a mosque in eastern Pakistan. And then savor the moment is something I always try to do. This was in Bangladesh a few years ago in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The guy on the left was my guide interpreter in Bangladesh. The guy on the left, or on the right, your right, was the driver of the car that I hired. And after traveling around for about a month, the driver one day issued an invitation, or presented an invitation to me to come to his house for dinner, which was a huge, huge deal for him, to actually invite a foreign guest into his house. And so I, of course, accepted. And so I went and spent the evening with them, met the family, just had a wonderful, wonderful time. And it struck me, and this picture kind of captures the preciousness of these encounters that we have in places, in foreign lands, and in our own lives, to be honest. But just capturing that moment and remembering it for what it is, getting the human value out of it. It's what restores my spirit and helps me do my job even when I'm far, far from home. And then finally, this is, we're going to be talking a lot this afternoon about Paul Selipek. This is a picture of Paul and some of his guys in Ethiopia walking across the open landscape in eastern Ethiopia. As you may or may not know at this point, Paul is walking in the footsteps of our ancient ancestors, the merry band of Homo sapiens who wandered out of Africa 60 to 70,000 years ago and started to explore the world. There were some experts believe that we, Homo sapiens, was down to a band of about 1,000 individuals. Imagine that. We had been so depleted by, I don't know what the factors were really. It's not well understood what drove us to leave Africa. And we had a happy home there for 1 million years as we were developing and becoming human, evolving, etc. But then about 60 or 70,000 years ago, things got so bad that we decided we had to push. We had to go somewhere else. And at that point, some experts, as I said, think we were down to a matter of hundreds or maybe 1,000 individual people. Today we live in a world that's populated by, we're closing in on 8 billion people. We crossed 7 billion back in 2011, I think. So think of all that's changed in both in the world, of course, but also in our own role in the world since those early days. We're living, Americans are living, that your students are living, in a country that's becoming more diverse with every passing year. We all know that. America's demographic makeup is changing. By 2030 or thereabouts, white Americans will make up less than half the population of the United States. So there is an increasing need to understand people who aren't exactly like us, that we see all around us in our own world. We're also living in an increasingly global and interconnected world, where the president of Microsoft or of GE is managing a company that includes tens of thousands of workers who speak dozens of languages in 180 countries around the world. The Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, thinks globally. I mean, what he does in Redmond, Washington has impacts all over the globe. China, Indonesia, South America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So and this is the way the world is going. This globalized world in which we live, in which business is conducted, in which markets develop, et cetera. This is a world that our students will inherit. This is the world they'll live in. And so understanding that world, understanding how people think in other places is imperative to succeed in that world. Geography is less of a barrier today than at any time in human history. That's pretty obvious. How many people have Facebook friends in other countries? It's amazing what's happened with communications, with email, with social media, et cetera, where those geographic barriers, an ocean, the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, is no longer nearly the factor that it once was. It's not exactly an invisible border, but it is less relevant in certain ways when you're connecting with people in other parts of the world. Understanding that interconnected world and its people has never been more important than it is today. Especially because with the world that we're leaving them, this next generation, 2,500 generations after that first band walked out of Africa, the generation that is coming to age now, your students and my students at the University of Richmond, are inheriting a world that has a major problem, maybe the biggest problem that we've ever faced as a species since that extinction event that closed in on our ancestors many, many years ago, 60,000 years ago. Climate change is something that is changing the world in front of us. I've traveled all over the world, and everywhere I've been in the last 15 years, 20 years, has been showing the subtle but increasing effects of climate change. Dealing with climate change is going to require our citizens, our people, our students to think more globally than humans ever have in the past. It's vital for our survival in certain ways as a species. The other thing that they're going to have to be dealing with is, the UN estimates that there'll be 250 million climate refugees by the year 2100. I've already seen it. I was in Bangladesh to look at the effects of climate change there. And you've got millions of people who are being uprooted because sea levels are rising. Cyclones and heavy weather is becoming more and more pronounced. Weather patterns are less predictable than they ever have been. They get floods, they get droughts at unpredictable times. There were many, many generations where farmers were able to kind of time their crops, et cetera, to the cycles of the weather. Those weather cycles have all been disrupted, and so you see a lot of people who are just being uprooted from their homes. And in the case of Bangladesh, 180 million people live in a state the size of Louisiana. It's a delta. The whole country is a delta. And so 180 million people, if they up and leave, have to go somewhere. A million of them, more than a million of them, have infiltrated, snuck across the border into India, and are working in low-paying jobs in cities and just kind of living off the land in India. But India today has stiffened its border restrictions, and actually I was along the border, the river that divides Bangladesh from India. Indian border guards have orders to shoot to kill, so that even some kid who whose cow, wanders and crosses the river, the kid that goes over there to fetch the family cow and bring him back gets shot by the Indian border guards. And so this is becoming an increasingly volatile issue between these two countries. Thousands of these Bangladeshis have been shot all along that border with India. And you can only imagine that the border with China will be similarly enforced. But those kinds of out-migrations of people who are being disrupted by climate change will become more and more of a factor. And one can only hope that as a species, as human beings, we can come up with a better solution, a better way of coping with it than we've displayed in the last 5 years as the refugees from Syria have poured out of that poor country, in search of a better life, trying to survive, trying to help their kids survive. And the greeting that they get when they enter Europe or Lord help them if they try to get into the United States, because it's become such a political issue. Reminds me of, thinking back to 60,000 years ago, as we'll do this afternoon some, that's a fundamental dilemma of human experience, I think. When you've got a stranger who shows up at your campfire asking for help, do you help them or do you attack them? That's been going on since we were sitting around campfires grunting at one another, I would expect. It's a fundamental dilemma of the human experience, how to deal with the other from people who aren't like us. And so our kids and our grandkids and the students in your classes and the students in my classes will have to grapple with that and just make up their own minds about whether somebody who's not like them is somehow less than human or is less than worthy, or whether that is somebody to be understood and cared about. So this is what you're teaching in class. This is why global literacy and cross-cultural communication is so very important. The other thing is, and I'll close here so we can take a few questions, but our kids, obviously, and we all are, drowning in information. And that makes it harder and harder to distinguish between truth and something that sounds like truth. As Stephen Colbert says, truthy. The difference between truth and truthy. The fact that somebody says it in an authoritative way on the internet and a blog, blah, 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 blah. Maybe it may be truth, but it's more likely truthy. It sounds like the truth, but it's not the truth. It's a distortion of fact, etc. And as we're sitting there feeding on the stuff that's coming downstream every day, it's becoming more and more important for us to be able to discern what's truth, what's fact, and what's not. In an average minute, 1 minute, 60 seconds, humans send out more than 200 million emails, perform 4 million searches on Google, like more than 4 million posts on Facebook, upload 300 hours of video to YouTube, and tap out almost 350,000 tweets. That's in an average minute. And so it's increasingly important that we help our students understand the difference between truth and truthy. And what we, in all this, I think, and I'll close pretty much with this, but what is sacrificed, I think, in that, as we drown in information, or what we are in danger of sacrificing, is meaning, is deeper meaning. And that's one thing that we can all work to instill in our students and in our daily lives and in our reporting, if we're a writer for National Geographic. Looking deeply into these situations, not just capturing little tidbits of facts, but looking for the meaning that lies under it, almost like the geological strata that underlie the landscape. The wind's blowing on the surface and the trees are moving around, but underneath there's a lot of drama there. There's the way this landscape has been formed is made of deeper stuff. And so it's incumbent upon us, I think, to help students understand that deeper meaning. without it, humanity is adrift in a sea of meaningless information. And we're also sitting ducks for the manipulator. I mean, if people are able to manipulate information and sound truthy and get away with it, we're sitting ducks. We're powerless, or we're at least vulnerable to the master manipulator, the charlatan, the profiteer, the tyrant masquerading as a silver-tongued devil. I mean, we see this all around us, of course. All of this makes what you do and what I try to do more important than ever. You're shaping the latest of a series of 2,500 generations that's lived on this earth since those early ancestors of ours walked out of Africa 60,000 years ago. Giving these young people the world is what you do, and it's what I try to do. Finally, I just wanted to take you back for a second to this group. To talk about the value of global experience, or of travel maybe, or of understanding the world beyond your doorstep. The guy that, I'm just going to point him out, this fellow here, his name is Frank. He's a wonderful guy, Frank Hart. He was the one that I was telling you about that complained all the time about everything and was constantly just bragging about every little thing that went wrong, making fun of the people that we were meeting, all this kind of stuff. Didn't speak a word of Spanish, didn't want to learn any Spanish. After our trip, I kind of lost touch with him, although I knew him through a mutual friend, and so, you know, he went to dental school, became a dentist, raised a family, got really good at tennis, etc. And just a couple of years ago, I bumped into Frank at a reunion, and I, reminded him the only thing we really have in common is this trip we took in 1973, and so I said, Frank, I took him back in the day. Remember that crazy trip we took in 1973? And I was fully expecting to get more of what I'd heard so much for like 2 months traveling around in Mexico. And bigotry, Don Rickles' routine about the locals, how poor it was, how uncomfortable he was, how dirty it was, on and on. I expected that. Instead, what I got back from Frank was a more wistful approach. And at one point he said, you know what, that trip was the highlight of my life. So, we live in an amazing world. It just, sometimes it takes a while for that to sink in. And so I would just leave you with that. Thanks again for coming. I look forward to working with you. I'm happy to take a few questions from the audience if there are any. Anyone?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, come to the microphone, yes.
As a journalist and a person who's traveled the world and met a lot of people, I'd like to have some of your thoughts. It's kind of a two-part question. What's the role of the media in covering the terrorist events, where the media creates a climate of fear versus a more realistic idea of the danger versus a deeper understanding of what this is all about? And the second part is, you just mentioned climate change. What's the role of the media in, versus creating the fear from terrorism versus the realistic fear from climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something, everybody heard that, I guess. The media has a very important role to play in all of this. We live in a democracy. A free press is an instrument that our society uses to find our way. And if the media is operating in a way that stokes those fears, those unreasonable fears, or creates sensational sort of reporting about things that aren't all that important, I see that a lot. I mean, I look at the network news or the cable news networks occasionally for my news. I try to find other sources as well, but I'm always dismayed at how all these very complex things are reduced to these little sound bites, these simplistic little conclusions that sound very alarming, that get people all riled up. And part of that has to be because those networks are depending on ratings. And the more people, the more eyeballs they can bring to their network, the better off they are. The more they can charge for advertising, blah, blah, blah. I mean, so it's a corporate problem in certain ways. And I'm really dismayed at the state of the news media in this country right now, especially as the groundswell of these other alternative sources fill in the gap or join the party, you know, of pontificating and the mainstream media has not been good enough at doing that important job that I talked about of discerning what's truth and what's not. There are constant cases where some blogger has invented something, basically, or pulled some little fact out of context and published it, and then it gets picked up by somebody like ABC or CNN or Fox or somebody, and suddenly the whole world is talking about it. Even though when you go back to the sources of that, you realize that there's nothing there, or that there is some sort of a political agenda there. It's really important that the media be gatekeepers in our society. And the second part of your question about climate change, you know, we tend to give equal time to the naysayers, to the critics, to the skeptics, etc. You know, there's this kind of, we've inherited as journalists this tradition of talking to both sides, presenting both sides of an issue. In climate change, you've got a situation where it's not a 50-50 thing. You know, 99.9% of scientists think this, and 1% or a tenth of a percent thinks something else. Not to discount, I mean, those people have a right to have their opinion about it, but to cover that as a viable, real debate between scientists who are, you know, struggling to ascertain the truth is a distortion of what reality is. And so it's important that the media reflect that, that true meaning of the debate. And so I'm disappointed, and I think that, you know, the next generation of journalists that I'm teaching in my class at the University of Richmond, and some of your students may be journalists one day. I mean, it's really important that we instill in them a reverence for the truth. And it's part of what I'm trying to do in my own small way, and I'm sure everybody in this room is doing the same. But we're in danger when our media becomes a circus like this. I mean, it's part of the reason Donald Trump has gotten as far as he has, is because the media hasn't asked tough questions and has covered it more as an entertainment story than as a political story. So, I don't know, that's just me talking, but that's kind of how I feel when I hear that question. Thank you for it.
Thank you for your presentation. And I was wondering, with this strange and dangerous phenomena of Trump on the one hand, and on the other hand, we've got some really growing and effective movements in America who are trying to change those things, like the Black Lives Matter movement, the Dreamers movement, the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions to change our government's policy and end Israeli occupation. And it seems to me that there's really a pressing, urgent need to get more of those stories out here, because a lot of what people operate on is fear and hatred and anger. And I'm wondering, with all your travels, have you considered doing more here? Because in many ways, the U.S. and especially our cities are a microcosm of the world.
Right, that's a very good question and a very good point. As far as working here, yeah, I think that it would be, what I would like to see more of is correspondents from other countries coming to the United States and registering their impressions of what's going on here. In certain ways, you can get a truer, a more interesting picture maybe by somebody who's coming from abroad to see and to call out some of these injustices that you're talking about for what they are. Those movements, I mean, I think that is the lifeblood of our country, the lifeblood of our democracy, that people aren't happy with the status quo and want to do something to change it, to bring it to the attention of their fellow citizens. It's what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing, it's what the Dreamers movement, the groundswell of support for Bernie Sanders, etc. people are standing up to be heard, and I think that's a really important aspect of our democracy. And the fact that it's mishandled or miscovered or disparaged in some way by mainstream media, or relegated to some sort of a fringe movement, I think does a disservice, and it's why people get frustrated. So I think I agree with you that there's a need for more coverage of those sorts of things or those sorts of phenomena in our own society. I tend to be better at foreign coverage than, I mean, there are a lot of great reporters and journalists who are working in this country, and their work deserves a lot of attention. People working for New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I mean, the Rolling Stone, Atlantic, these kinds of magazines, National Geographic occasionally, to cover those subjects in great depth and with a balanced and objective perspective. But there needs to be more of it, that's for sure. Yes.
Hi, I'm curious, how many countries have you been to, and how many passports have you had? And then finally, what is the most uncomfortable or most dangerous situation you've ever been in your travel?
Well, that's a good question. My biography says 80. I think that's about right. I've traveled to about 80 countries over the last 30 years. Passports, I've had a bunch. I've usually, for the last 20 years or so, I've always kept two. Had a second passport so that because there's this monkey business that happens between Israel and Arab countries, and sometimes between India and Pakistan. You know, I keep Pakistan in one passport, I keep my Arab passport stamps in one passport, another one I go to India with, and Israel with. It's just that simple, because I have been in situations where, the first time I went to Syria, I had a stamp from Israel in my passport. And I mean, it was a major deal. I had a high-level invitation from the Minister of Information to come in and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, when the border guards saw my passport and saw that Hebrew writing on the stamp, guns were cocked. I mean, it was kind of like they felt like they were being invaded, and so there was some fast talking to get on the horn to Damascus and get my approval, as it were. As far as danger goes, you know, I'm somewhat oblivious. I probably have had more close calls than I realize. Probably driving in third world countries like Bangladesh at night, or in India, or those kinds of places, are probably closer to the edge there than I realize. The only time the times that I can remember being disturbed, like physically scared, was when I was in a crowd. And I was in a crowd situation in Israel one time after a bus bombing that had killed a bunch of Israeli school kids, and I was just down the road. I had my own kids were in a kindergarten on the kibbutz where I was living. And I was one of the first people on the scene after that bus bombing, and within 15 minutes, it was like hordes of people poured in from all over Israel to protest, and the behavior of that crowd took on a life of its own. I mean, it was an animal. The crowd was an animal that would have turned on a dime to destroy an Arab if there had been an Arab on the street. I was physically afraid to be in that crowd because it was so unpredictable what it was going to do next. I was in a similar sort of crowd in an Arab village in Israel on Land Day, the big day where Palestinians kind of commemorate the land that they lost in 1948. And it was a similar sort of thing, a big crowd in a little village, packed into roads, narrow roads that overlooked a drop-off, like a cliff. And so for me to be in that crowd covering that situation with a photographer who was trying to take pictures of it, I mean, we were both afraid that we were just going to get pushed out and over the edge of the cliff, basically. Those are the kinds of things that do kind of scare me, is being in a crowd where I have absolutely no control. The other thing I'll just add is that I always pay close attention to the people that I have working with me. these interpreters or guides or fixers. I hire them because they know the security situation. They know when things are getting out of hand. They know when it's time to get the hell out. Excuse my French. They can read those situations and tell you, okay, we gotta go now. Not in a minute, right now, we gotta go. I just saw a guy pick up a cell phone, and I don't know who he's talking to, but there's a chance that somebody's gonna pull up here in a car and throw you in the back. So let's get out of here. So I'm always paying close attention to those kind of cues.
Don, can we take one more question?
Okay, one more.
I wanted to know if you had visited Cuba, and what are your predictions on what Cuba might be like now that our foreign policy toward that country has changed or is changing?
Wow. Cuba's high on my list of places I want to go. I've never been to Cuba, and I'm dying to go. I'm not an expert on it, so I'm not going to really go into what the ramifications or the kind of the aftermath of this sea change in our policy toward Cuba might be. A lot will depend on what happens after the Castro brothers leave the scene. What that next generation of leadership is like in Cuba, we'll see. I happened to celebrate along with a lot of other people when that move was made by the Obama administration to finally change a policy that has not worked. It's just isolating Cuba. It's just an anomaly in today's world. And so I have high hopes that Cuba will rejoin the family of nations, that we'll be able to freely travel there and get a look at the place. There's a side of me, of course, that wants it to kind of remain captured in amber, right? So like a museum piece, so we can go and marvel at those 1954 Chevrolets, But beyond that, I'm excited about it. I'm really, really anxious to go. Honestly, that's at the top of my list of places that I do want to travel. Thank you.
So I'd like to give Dawn 10 minutes to rest up for the next portion of the program. If you checked in and did not receive a folder, please go pick one up. There have been some last minute cancellations, so you can grab a folder from one of my colleagues outside. 10-minute break, we'll reconvene and shift gears to the next